14 German fighters closing fast, a formation of bombers bleeding fuel and fire, and one pilot who ignored every rule in the manual and told his crew to hold tight. He was going to do something no one in the European sky had ever tried. They thought he was insane. 5 minutes later, they were alive, and the Luftwaffe had a new nightmare to report. The winter of 1943 carved deep into the bones of every airman stationed in England. Ice formed on the glass, breath fogged the oxygen masks. Below, the patchwork quilt of Britain's countryside disappeared beneath December fog, and above, the contrails of 1,000 bombers scratched white lines into the gray ceiling of war. This was the height of the combined bomber offensive. The 8th Air Force had committed itself to daylight precision bombing, a doctrine rooted in American confidence and the hope that the Norden bomb site could hit a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. In theory, waves of B-17 flying fortresses would sweep across occupied Europe, destroy German war infrastructure, and return home under the protective umbrella of their own massed firepower. In practice, it was slaughter. German fighters tore into the bomber streams with methodical violence. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s climbed high, positioned themselves nose-on, and hurtled toward the formations at closing speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. The head-on attack became the signature tactic of the Luftwaffe day fighter squadrons. It was brutal, efficient, and psychologically devastating. The bombers had no forward-firing guns. Their nose turrets carried twin 50-caliber machine guns, but the gunners had only seconds to track, lead, and fire before the enemy flashed past or through the formation. Most B-17s went down without ever landing a meaningful hit on their attackers. The gunners knew it, the pilots knew it, and the Germans knew it. By December, loss rates on some missions exceeded 20%. Entire squadrons evaporated over the Ruhr Valley or the rail yards at Schweinfurt. Crews flew their tours in a state of fatalistic endurance, counting missions like prison days, knowing the odds were stacked against survival. Into this environment came thousands of young men who had never seen combat, farm boys from Iowa, mechanics from Detroit, college dropouts and factory workers who had volunteered or been drafted into a war that demanded they climb into aluminum tubes and fly into storms of steel. They learned formation discipline, oxygen management, and how to aim a gun through frozen gloves. But no one taught them how to survive the head-on pass. There was no manual for that, just acceptance and luck. The 8th Air Force tried tactics, tighter formations, staggered altitudes, fighter escorts when range allowed. But in late 1943, the P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings could barely reach the German border before turning back. The bombers flew alone over the heart of the Reich, and the Luftwaffe waited. The sound of it all was deafening and unreal. The roar of Wright Cyclone engines at cruise power, the rattle of gun turrets swiveling on ball bearings, the crackle of radio chatter as pilots called out enemy positions, then the scream of diving fighters, the hammering staccato of 20mm cannon fire punching through aluminum skin, the wet thud of rounds hitting flesh, and sometimes the terrible silence when an engine stopped or a wing folded, and a bomber began its long fall toward the earth. It was into this crucible that First Lieutenant James Howard flew his 23rd mission. If this history matters to you, tap like and subscribe. James Howell. Howard did not look like a man destined to rewrite fighter tactics. He was quiet, disciplined, a thinker more than a talker. Born in Canton, China, in 1913 to missionary parents, he spent his childhood surrounded by languages, cultures, and the constant hum of uncertainty. His father ran a medical mission. His mother taught school. Howard grew up watching people solve problems with limited resources and no backup plan. He returned to the United States for college, enrolled at Pomona, and studied pre-med. But the pull of aviation was stronger than anatomy. In 1937, he left school and joined the Navy as an aviation cadet. He washed out, not for lack of skill, but for a minor medical disqualification that kept him grounded. It could have ended there. For most, it would have. Howard went to China. He joined the American Volunteer Group, the Flying Tigers, in 1941, just months before Pearl Harbor. Under Claire Chennault, he flew Curtiss P-40 Warhawks against Japanese bombers and fighters over Burma and southern China. The AVG fought outnumbered, outgunned, and isolated. They had no spare parts, no reinforcements, and no margin for error. Survival depended on ingenuity, aggression, and the ability to think 3 moves ahead. Howard thrived. He learned to exploit the P-40's strengths: its dive speed, its ruggedness, its ability to absorb punishment and keep flying. He learned to bait enemy fighters into bad positions, to use the sun and clouds as cover, and to never, ever fight fair. In 6 months, he was credited with 6 confirmed kills and became one of the AVG's most reliable pilots. When the Flying Tigers disbanded in mid-1942, Howard returned to the United States and joined the Army Air Forces. He expected to be sent to the Pacific. Instead, he was assigned to the 8th Air Force and posted to England as a fighter pilot with the 354th Fighter Squadron, part of the newly formed 355th Fighter Group. They were flying P-51 Mustangs, sleek, long-range fighters that would eventually become the most famous escorts of the war. But in late 1943, the Mustang force was still small. The bomber offensive was reaching its peak, and the losses continued to mount. Howard was older than most fighter pilots. At 30, he was a veteran in a squadron of 22-year-olds. He did not drink heavily or chase thrills. He studied mission reports. He asked questions. He thought in systems, how the enemy moved, how formations worked, where the gaps were. His squadron mates respected him but did not fully understand him. He was competent, calm, and oddly fearless in a way that seemed less like bravado and more like calculation. He flew like a man solving an equation in real time. On January 11, 1944, Howard was assigned to escort a bomber formation targeting German industrial facilities near Oschersleben, deep in central Germany. It was a maximum-range mission. The fighters would have just enough fuel to reach the bombers, stay with them for a few critical minutes, and race back to England before their tanks ran dry. Howard took off in the early morning cold, formed up with his flight, and climbed toward the bomber stream. He had no way of knowing that in less than an hour he would be alone over Germany with a choice no doctrine had prepared him for. The mission began to fracture 20 minutes from the target. Cloud cover thickened over the North Sea. Visibility dropped. Radio discipline deteriorated as flights struggled to maintain visual contact. The bomber stream stretched out, lost cohesion, and became vulnerable. Then the first German fighters appeared. They came in flights of 4 and 6, climbing out of the haze, positioning themselves ahead of the bombers. The Luftwaffe had refined the art of interception into a choreographed violence. Fighters would climb above and ahead, roll inverted, and dive straight through the formation nose first. The closing speed gave gunners almost no time to react, and the concentration of fire, cannon and machine guns converging on a single bomber, was often catastrophic. The P-51 escorts engaged. Dogfights erupted across the sky. Pilots broke formation to chase attackers or defend bombers under fire. Within minutes, the neat geometry of the escort dissolved into chaos. Howard's flight was pulled into a running engagement with a group of Focke-Wulf 190s. He fired, maneuvered, and tried to stay between the enemy and the bombers. But the math was unforgiving. There were too many Germans and too few escorts. Fuel was already a concern. Every minute of combat burned gallons they could not spare. Then Howard looked up and saw them, a formation of B-17s, perhaps 30 bombers, separated from the main stream and drifting west. They were alone, no other escorts in sight, and beneath them, climbing in a lazy spiral, were at least a dozen German fighters preparing to strike. Howard checked his fuel. He checked his position. He tried to raise his flight on the radio. Static. He scanned the sky for other P-51s. None. The bombers had minutes, maybe less, before the first attack run. If Howard turned back, he might make it home. If he engaged alone, he would be outnumbered more than 10-1. And even if he survived the initial pass, the Luftwaffe would swarm him the moment they realized he was the only defender. It was not a decision that doctrine covered. It was not a scenario taught in training. It was a simple, brutal calculus. Abandon them or fight. Howard shoved the throttle forward and dove toward the bombers. The German fighters had not yet committed to their attack. They were still positioning, communicating, setting up the run. Howard knew he had one advantage: surprise. They did not expect a lone Mustang to challenge an entire staffel. He closed the distance fast. The bombers grew larger in his windscreen. He could see the ball turrets rotating, the waist gunners tracking movement, the formation tightening instinctively in response to the threat below. Then the first German flight peeled off and dove. Howard rolled hard, pulled lead, and fired. His tracers laced through the air and clipped the wing of a Messerschmitt. The fighter broke off, trailing smoke. The others scattered. Confusion rippled through the German formation. One escort should not have been a problem, but Howard was not flying like an escort. He flew like a man with nothing to lose and a perfect understanding of geometry. The Luftwaffe reorganized. They came again and again, head-on passes, beam attacks, slashing dives from above. Howard met each one with fire and maneuver. He did not try to dogfight. He did not chase. He stayed close to the bombers and made himself the problem every German pilot had to solve before they could reach their targets. And then he did something no one expected. He flew into the middle of the bomber formation. Fighter doctrine in 1943 was clear. Escorts stayed outside the bomber formation. They patrolled the flanks, the high cover, the approach vectors. They intercepted enemy fighters before they reached the heavies. Close escort was considered defensive, passive, and ineffective. No one flew inside the formation. The risk was too high. Bombers flew tight, wingtip to wingtip, with minimal room for error. Turbulence from props and slipstreams created invisible walls of disturbed air. A fighter caught in the wake could lose control, collide, or be shot down by friendly fire. Bomber gunners were trained to fire at anything that moved within range. Friend or foe, if it was close and fast, they shot. But Howard understood something the doctrine writers did not. The German head-on attack depended on a clear run. The fighters needed a straight line, high speed, and an unobstructed field of fire. If a defending fighter positioned itself directly in front of the bombers, between the Germans and their targets, the attackers had two choices: break off or risk a head-on collision with an armed opponent traveling at combined closure speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour. Howard slid his Mustang into the lead element of the bomber formation. He throttled back to match their speed. He flew just ahead of the lead B-17, low and centered, his fighter silhouetted against the sky. The bomber crews saw him. They did not know what he was doing. Some thought he was lost. Others feared he had been hit and was trying to ditch near the formation for rescue. A few gunners tracked him reflexively, fingers near triggers, waiting to see if he was friend or threat. Then the Germans came again. 2 Messerschmitts, diving from 11 o'clock high, nose on, cannons charged. They had a perfect angle. The bombers were locked in formation, unable to evade. The closure was textbook, but Howard was there. He held his position, waited until the last possible second, then fired a short burst and broke left. The lead German flinched, rolled, and pulled out of the dive. The second fighter followed. Neither pressed the attack. The risk was too high. The Mustang was in the way, and it was shooting. Howard climbed, rolled, and returned to the formation. He tucked himself back into the lead element, just ahead and slightly below. The bombers adjusted. The pilots understood now. He was not lost. He was a shield. The Germans regrouped. They tried beam attacks. Howard met them from the side. They tried vertical dives. He climbed and forced them to overshoot. They tried coordinated runs from multiple angles. He pivoted, fired, and disrupted each one. The Luftwaffe was not retreating. They were persistent, skilled, and motivated. But they were also constrained by physics and risk tolerance. Every pass Howard contested was a pass that failed, and every failed pass burned fuel, morale, and time. The bomber gunners began to coordinate with him. They held fire when he maneuvered, giving him space. They called out threats over the radio. They watched his six and covered his blind spots. An unplanned, unspoken partnership emerged, 1 fighter and 30 bombers working together against an enemy that outnumbered them all. For 30 minutes, Howard fought alone. He burned through ammunition. He burned through fuel. He took hits, small caliber rounds that punched through his fuselage and missed critical systems by inches. His engine ran hot. His hands ached. His vision tunneled from adrenaline and oxygen debt. But the bombers held formation, and the Germans began to disengage. The moment Howard's fuel gauge dipped below reserve, the Luftwaffe broke off. It was not a retreat. It was a calculation. The bombers were nearing the edge of the target zone. Allied fighters would return soon. The risk-reward ratio had shifted. The German fighters peeled away in pairs, diving toward lower altitude and disappearing into the cloud deck. Howard watched them go. He did not chase. He had no fuel, no ammunition, and barely enough airspeed to stay aloft. He eased his Mustang out of the formation. The lead B-17 wagged its wings, a silent acknowledgment. Howard returned the gesture, rolled level, and began the long glide back toward England. His engine coughed twice. Fuel starvation. He adjusted the mixture, leaned it out as far as he dared, and coaxed another 10 minutes of power from a nearly empty tank. The English coast appeared through the haze. He crossed at 2,000 feet, too low for safety, too high to bail out. He landed at the first available field. The Mustang rolled to a stop. The engine died. Howard sat in the cockpit, silent, as ground crew ran toward him. They found bullet holes in the wings, the tail, and the fuselage. They found an engine that had been running on fumes and prayer. They found a pilot who had flown deeper into enemy territory, stayed longer under fire, and engaged more aircraft than any escort mission on record. But they did not find a scratch on him. Howard climbed out, filed a brief combat report, and said little. He mentioned the bombers, the Germans, and the maneuver. He did not embellish. He did not claim certainty. He simply described what happened. The bomber crews told a different story. When they landed back at their bases in England, they debriefed with intelligence officers and recounted the mission. They described the lone Mustang that had stayed with them for half an hour. They described the pilot who had flown inside their formation, absorbed attacks meant for them, and turned himself into a moving roadblock against an entire German fighter group. The gunners estimated 14 separate enemy aircraft engaged. Some said more. All agreed on one thing. Without that pilot, they would not have made it home. Word spread quickly. Within days, the story reached 8th Air Force headquarters. Commanders reviewed Howard's report, cross-referenced it with bomber crew testimony, and analyzed the tactical implications. What Howard had done violated protocol. It was reckless by the book. But it had worked. And in a war where bomber losses were crippling morale and operational capacity, results mattered more than orthodoxy. In April 1944, James Howard was awarded the Medal of Honor. He was the only fighter pilot in the European theater to receive the nation's highest military decoration. The citation praised his courage, his skill, and his selfless devotion to the bomber crews under his protection. But the citation did not mention the one thing that mattered most. Howard had not fought out of blind heroism. He had fought out of logic. He had seen a problem, analyzed the variables, and executed a solution that no manual had predicted. He had turned himself into a weapon not through firepower, but through positioning. He had understood that presence, not kills, was the key to disruption. And in doing so, he had revealed a flaw in German tactics that no one had exploited before. The head-on attack had been the Luftwaffe's most effective weapon against American daylight bombers. It relied on speed, shock, and the bombers' lack of forward firepower. But it also relied on a psychological truth. Escorts stayed outside. Fighters protected bombers from a distance. They did not get in the way. Howard proved that assumption wrong. Within weeks of his mission, the 8th Air Force began to train escort pilots in close-in defensive tactics. The idea was not to replicate Howard's lone stand, that was unsustainable and suicidal by design, but to incorporate elements of his positioning strategy into coordinated escort doctrine. Fighters began to fly tighter to the bombers. They positioned themselves along the attack vectors most likely to be used by German fighters. They did not wait for threats to develop. They preempted them. The mere presence of a fighter in the path of a head-on run forced German pilots to hesitate, adjust, or abort. Loss rates began to decline. It was not immediate. It was not the only factor. The introduction of long-range P-51 escorts, improved formation tactics, and attrition of Luftwaffe pilots all played roles. But the shift in fighter positioning, the willingness to get closer, to accept risk, and to disrupt rather than simply intercept, became a permanent feature of escort operations for the remainder of the war. Bomber crews noticed the change. They felt safer. They flew with more confidence, and they spoke of Howard's mission as proof that one pilot, in the right place at the right time, could alter the course of a battle. The Germans noticed, too. Intelligence reports from captured Luftwaffe pilots referenced American fighters that refused to leave the bombers, that stayed close even under fire, and that made coordinated attacks far more difficult. The tactic did not stop German interceptions, but it reduced their effectiveness, and in a war of attrition, that was enough. Howard returned to combat. He flew additional missions, trained new pilots, and continued to refine his approach. He was not a natural self-promoter. He did not give interviews or seek recognition. He flew, fought, and survived. By the end of the war, he had been credited with 6 aerial victories in the European theater, on top of his 6 with the Flying Tigers. His official tally was modest compared to some aces. But numbers alone did not measure his impact. He had shown that courage without logic was noise, and logic without courage was theory. Only together could they change the outcome. James Howard survived the war. He stayed in the Air Force, rose to the rank of brigadier general, and retired in 1966 after nearly 30 years of service. He lived quietly in Florida, far from the spotlight, and rarely spoke publicly about the mission that earned him the Medal of Honor. When asked about it in later years, he would say only that he did what the situation required. He did not call it heroism. He called it problem-solving, He saw bombers in danger, saw a gap in the defenses, and filled it. The fact that it worked, he said, was as much luck as skill. But those who flew with him disagreed. They saw a man who had trained himself to think under fire, to stay calm when chaos ruled, and to act decisively when others would have hesitated. They saw someone who understood that war was not won by following rules. It was won by knowing when to break them. The maneuver Howard used that day, flying inside the bomber formation to disrupt head-on attacks, was never officially codified. It was too dangerous, too dependent on individual judgment, and too easy to misapply. But it lived on in the oral tradition of fighter tactics. Instructors told the story, pilots debated it, and in the decades that followed, variations of the concept appeared in air combat doctrine around the world. Howard's legacy was not a single tactic. It was a mindset, the understanding that air combat was not about bravery alone, but about geometry, timing, and the willingness to occupy the space where the enemy least expected you. In the vast library of World War II aviation history, his name appears less often than it should. He was not flashy. He did not accumulate a high score. He did not fit the archetype of the swaggering ace. But the bomber crews who made it home on January 11, 1944, knew what he had done. And they carried that knowledge with them for the rest of their lives. Some of them named their sons after him. Some wrote letters thanking him decades after the war. Some simply told the story again and again to anyone who would listen. Because in a war that consumed millions, James Howard reminded them that one person, in one moment, could still tip the balance. Not through firepower, not through luck, but through the rare combination of clarity, courage, and the refusal to accept that the impossible was truly impossible. He died in 1995 at the age of 81. His funeral was attended by veterans, fellow pilots, and men who had flown in bombers over Germany 50 years before. They did not speak of tactics or doctrine. They spoke of the day a lone Mustang stayed when every logical reason said to leave. And they spoke of the lesson he left behind, that the most powerful weapon in war is not the machine, but the mind that dares to use it differently.